I noticed it's been over 2 years since the last webinar on LibPress accessibility. So I kind of wanted to take this chance to revisit the topic and recap, check in on where everyone is at with the Accessible BC Act and go over some additional tools that can also help with accessibility and general usability on your site. So we'll go over the Accessible BC Act compliance and how that relates to your website. This will take up the first half of the webinar, and it'll be most relevant to BC libraries. So I'll just give any Manitoba attendees the heads up about that right now. And I will touch on some elements of the Accessibility for Manitobans Act, but mostly just for context and information. And the reason why I'm not focusing on that legislation today is because it's been in place much longer than BC's. It was implemented in 2013. So most entities have already kind of made their way meaningfully toward compliance. We'll also kind of talk about compliance and then usability and how those two work in the context of accessibility. And then we'll go into some free tools and some demos of things that you can do to make your site more usable and more accessible. And wanted to kind of set the scope a little bit to, I myself am not an accessibility expert. I'm really interested in it and do work around it. I'm not an expert. And individual library compliance with the Accessible BC Act is not something that LibPress or the co-op is responsible for. But that being said, the team is here to support you with making sure your websites meet the certain standards and best practices. So that's why we're going into this topic today. And there's lots of information out there about this legislation coming from all these different organizations that you might have seen names of flying around. So my goal is to kind of bring some of that together into a digestible format, help you understand where you are at on the road to compliance, whether you have already gotten a good start and you're kind of building upon what you already have in place, or if you're more at the beginning of that journey, and to hopefully leave you with a clear idea of what you might want to work on next in terms of accessibility on your site. And I'll also say that the webinar today presents general information about Accessible BC Act compliance and how it relates to public libraries. But all of the different libraries are probably going to be at different stages and places along the road. So if there's something you're not sure about your specific library's process, please check in with your leadership team. So of course, this is not going to be new to anybody. The Accessible BC Act was enacted in 2021 as a legislation to identify and remove barriers to accessibility for people with disabilities in BC and to also prevent new barriers. And then quickly following that in 2022, the BC government adopted the Accessible BC regulation, which is what prescribed these accessibility committee plan and feedback mechanism requirements for over 750 public sector organizations. And organizations were required to comply by September 1st, 2024. And so the regulation is now considered to be fully in force. There was a compliance audit conducted in fall 2024 that found that more than 80% of obligated organizations were in compliance or had publicly initiated the work needed to become compliant. So, efforts are continuing across the board. And part of this webinar was to just support any of that remaining 20% that might be within the LibPress system, who might not have yet addressed the requirements fully in order to be compliant. And just to kind of like contrast with Manitoba, the Accessibility for Manitobans Act became law in 2013. Manitoba was the second province in Canada to introduce accessibility legislation after Ontario. And similarly to the Accessible BC Act, this piece of legislation provided a process to identify, prevent, and remove barriers. And it's made up of 5 kind of building blocks that are customer service standards, employment standards, information and communication standards, which is where kind of like digital communications and website stuff kind of falls under that pillar, transportation standards, and outdoor spaces. So I'm going to send out a resource list at the end of today's session that has all the links and everything I'm talking about. So if you're curious to learn more about that, you'll be able to read up on it. And yeah, just to define kind of some of the terms that are flying around, prescribed organization is the terminology in the Accessible BC Act that describes a public sector entity that is mandated to comply with the accessibility requirements. So this includes crown corporations, health authorities, school boards, post-secondary institutions, municipalities of all sizes, and of course, public libraries. It also includes private sector entities over 50 employees. And in the Manitoba legislation, the terminology for this is public sector bodies. So those are kind of interchangeable in the two different acts. So all of that groundwork. And now we can kind of talk about what those requirements actually are. And this will probably also be refresher for most folks. Nothing super brand new here. But the Accessible BC Act is in three parts, and it's part three that we're concerned with. It is what lays out these requirements for what public sector organizations need to do in order to be compliant. So it's establishing and forming an accessibility committee. Then that committee develops an accessibility plan, and then having some kind of tool or feedback mechanism that the public can use to give your organization feedback about accessibility barriers that they may face at your establishment. So in our case, libraries. And before we jump into looking at each of those in detail, this is where I wanted to kind of introduce this like theme that I want to keep in mind for the rest of the webinar of compliance and then usability when it comes to accessibility. So, compliance is basically just like the bare minimum that you need to do to not be breaking the law. So it's just ensuring that any entity meets, a specific minimum legal standard that's laid out in order to avoid liability. Whereas usability focuses more on, how effectively and efficiently someone can actually use your service or product and how satisfied they are with that experience. And to use an example that's relevant to what we're talking about today, like a library could have an accessibility committee, but they only meet once a year to just kind of like sign off on some decisions, or they have an accessibility plan that they worked on once and kind of said, okay, cool, we did that, and then they publish it somewhere deep on a page in their site. So technically you're like quote compliant by doing that, but it's not really effective in kind of like tangibly improving the lives and experiences of people with disabilities. So it can often be this kind of like checkbox exercise, whereas usability is more user-centric, and balancing both is important because, compliance obviously doesn't guarantee usability, but the same way, high usability doesn't always mean regulatory compliance. So what I'm getting at is that meeting the legal requirements by having this committee and the plan and the feedback tool is kind of just the baseline. And you can technically be in compliance with the Act by checking the boxes, but it doesn't really mean that your library or library website is necessarily accessible, or that people with disabilities can meaningfully use it. So the best approach treats compliance as a starting point and not a finish line. And the process should be about creating a culture of accessibility where removing barriers is ongoing work and not a one-time project. And the way that you're engaging with the Accessible BC Act should be user-centered and responsive to your users' needs as well. So back to these three requirements. Number one, as I mentioned, establishing the committee. The committee should have at least half of its members be people living with disabilities or representing organizations that serve people living with disabilities. There should be at least one person representing Indigenous people on the committee. And organizations all, have different capacities and priorities and requirements. So the committees are going to look different because they'll be tailored to meet the organization's context. And, a small community library in a rural place is going to have a different committee than, a large urban multi-branch library system. So there's not like a prescribed, other than these kind of like general requirements, there's not like a prescriptive, like it has to look one certain way. The committees can also be made up of more than one organization. So, a library could be part of a joint committee, whether that's, with other municipal entities in your city or town, whether that's, your regional library system or your library federation that you're a part of. Ultimately, the decision about how to structure the committee is up to you and your local government. But those are all kind of some of the ways that it could look. And then once the committee is formed, then they set about developing the plan. So the act is also not prescriptive in what this plan needs to look like. It gives some specifics, but there's lots of room for flexibility and interpretation. The regulation requires that you use specific guiding principles in how you develop the plan, but from there, it's kind of to the individual committee's discretion on how that plan comes together. There is a guide on the BC Accessibility Hub, which is available online, and it will be included on the resource list that I'm going to email out at the end. And then, like, how does that all even relate to the website? Anyway, so organizations don't need to submit their plans to the government, but they do need to make it available to the public. And of course, the simplest and most common way to achieve that requirement is to just publish it on your website. So in terms of your LibPress site, you will want to know, what committee you're part of, where the plan is, where to find it. If you're part of a committee that's at like a higher organizing level than you, your federation or your municipal government, if they're responsible for the committee and the plan, then like you're kind of covered under that, you're compliant. But you can also use that as a moment to kind of reflect on usability and consider linking to that on your site or including it on your site. Having it on the federation site or on the municipal government site is, you're technically compliant, but your individual library patrons may not know where to find that information. So I have like an example of that. I was looking at Cranbrook Public Library's site, and they've got something that I will pull up here. Let's see. So Cranbrook Public Library is a LibPress site. I didn't look to see in the attendees if Cranbrook's here today, but if you are, shout out. So in the footer here, they have this accessibility plan feedback button, which takes you to this page, and then it links to the accessibility plan here, which goes to the Kootenay Library's accessibility plan. And I know lots of LibPress libraries are part of this. So if you are, you may have something like this already happening on your site, but I just thought that was a nice, simple example of that. And just wanted to come over here and have a quick look at it. Yes, that's me, Gwendolyn. Awesome. Thanks for that. Yeah, it looks great. I love it. Yeah, great example. And I know there are probably many, many more examples out there, but this is the one that I saw and thought I'll just show that as a quick sample. So yeah, I think lots of patrons don't know that like federations even exist. So having stuff at the federation level is always nice to display it on your library site, since you're kind of that trusted community presence. Thirdly is that feedback mechanism. So in order to be compliant with the Act, we want prescribed organizations to establish a mechanism for the public to provide feedback on accessibility barriers. And this mechanism is something that is mandatory. It must be public facing, and it must allow individuals to report barriers in services, programs, or infrastructure. And in terms of libraries, this includes, physical barriers in the library space, as well as virtual barriers on your site or on digital resources or online program offerings. And when you receive feedback, it's also important to demonstrate that you've listened. So having a way to, having a procedure in place to reply thoughtfully to the patron and put actionable changes into place wherever possible. And similarly, the Accessibility for Manitobans Act requires public sector bodies to provide a process for receiving and responding to feedback on the accessibility of the organization's information and communication. They don't require the other two parts, but this is something that's similar across the two acts. And yeah, they just have to document the actions they take to respond to the feedback they receive and make that information available on request, which is something that the BC Act doesn't mandate. So similar and a little different. In terms of your LibPress site, a common way to meet this requirement is to have an accessibility feedback form on your website. And just note that this is different than your general feedback form. It's going to have different questions on it that aid the patron or library visitor in describing the accessibility barrier that they experienced and giving you the necessary details to take action where you're able to. Your municipal government or federation, library federation might have this form or a feedback mechanism in some way, shape, or form in place, but having it on your site can really do a lot for usability. It can play a big role in creating a trusted and secure space for providing feedback and making it easier for the person experiencing the barrier to have it addressed by people that they know at the actual library versus, this kind of like bigger kind of faceless organizations that they might not have that more individual connection with. And we want this feedback mechanism to be easy to find and easy to use. So if you have one already, that's awesome. If you don't have one yet, we have a template that is based on a form from Powell River Public Library site. There's a staff member there who was working on accessibility for a while as part of, I think, I don't know, it's a kind of a short, limited period, intensive accessibility work that they were doing on their site. And they made a really awesome feedback form that I asked if they would be open to allowing me to duplicate it and offer it out to other libraries in the LibPress system who would be interested in using it. And they said yes. So that's great. And I have a sample on the Maple demo site now. We also have a digital accessibility statement template on that page. I'm going to switch to it in just a sec. That accessibility statement is not a requirement of the Accessible BC Act, but it's kind of could become a requirement soon, / is just a good practice and easy thing to kind of put in place. So I'll switch back to this window and we'll go to the accessibility area here. And as we go through this page, you might reflect on what you already have in place on your site and, might get some ideas for things you may want to add or change. We start up at the top with a general accessibility statement about the library's commitment to providing a welcoming and inclusive place for all community members. You'll also find the placeholders to add links to your library's accessibility committee information and accessibility plan information. I'll skip down to the bottom for a moment before going to the feedback form, and we'll take a look at the digital accessibility statement. And this is just a simple template to, again, inform site visitors about our commitment to providing an accessible digital space. You'll note that it states our current compliance with WCAG or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and clearly states the level that we are currently at. And it also gives you a spot down here to put contact phone or email, like a direct contact phone or email for somebody at your library who would be the one to take calls or emails from patrons that are about accessibility concerns or barriers. And that's just in addition to the form that we have linked up here at the top of the page. So in this feedback section, I will now go into the specific form here. So at the top, just a bit of information about what a barrier is and a spot to let folks know how their personal information is being collected. And then we go into the questions of the form. It can be filled out by somebody who experienced the barrier firsthand. It can be somebody filling this form in on behalf of that person, or it can just be a helpful member of the public making a recommendation for something that they noticed. There's an area here to describe what you were trying to do or what you were trying to access when you experienced the barrier, where the barrier was, what the barrier was, what type of barrier it was, and then a open text area here to fill in the recommendations or give more information down here, option for the person filling out the form to leave their name and their contact information. The form can also be submitted anonymously. None of these fields are mandatory. And of course, we have other text boxes throughout so that if the prescribed options aren't capturing exactly what the person would like to report, they can fill it in themselves. So if you would like to have one of these forms implemented on your site, you have our support in doing that. And we'll just need the following information from you. So you can either let me know before we end the webinar today or submit a ticket afterwards with the following details. We'll just want to know any fields that you might want removed from or added from that template that you can see on the Maple demo site, and a name, title, email, and phone for the person responsible for FIPA compliance at your library. We'll just put that into the top area of that form where it described how we're collecting personal information. I'll want an email address where you'd like the form responses to be sent, and just a location on your site where you would want that form. So either a new page specifically for it, or if you already have an accessibility page on your site that you'd like the form linked to, just let me know that information and I can get that done for you. I'll stop here for just a sec because that's kind of the end of the BC, Accessible BC Act specific part of the content. So I'll just kind of pause and see if anybody has other questions about that before we move into just some general tools for accessibility and usability on your site. And I'm going to take a drink of water. Awesome. Okay. So let's take a look at some tools. Now that we've covered compliance, we'll get a bit deeper into, real usability and things that make sure the content that you add to your site is accessible and usable. Ideally, we're all regularly auditing our content and testing and prioritizing fixes based on their impact. And a lot of the core LibPress accessibility considerations are taken care of on the staff side by our developer. But as site managers, you're also you have control over making sure the content, the text and images and things you create in Canva, making sure that kind of stuff is accessible and usable. So we're going to first talk about checking broken links, which, broken links might seem kind of minor as in terms of an inconvenience, but they can present a significant accessibility barrier for people using screen readers or other assistive technologies, unlike sighted users who might quickly, just visually scan a page and move on. When you find a broken link, people using screen readers experience websites sequentially, making broken links more disruptive. And broken links can also undermine trust. If someone's trying to access a service or register for a program or find critical information, the link doesn't work, they might assume, the service is not reliable or that the library's online presence isn't reliable. So regular link checking can be important for, ensuring that everyone can reach what they're looking for. Back in the summer, Sam, our developer, and I had gone through, a ton of options to find and test out some free open source broken link checkers that worked within, our needs and the multi-site nature of LibPress and the co-op's web security policies. And the one that we selected as of this week is no longer being supported, which was unfortunate. I had tested it out with a couple libraries and they thought it was awesome and we're ready to launch it. But yeah, this happens frequently with these kinds of tools. These kinds of automated link checkers, they work by crawling and scanning sites in rapid succession, and they're often misidentified by websites as bots and bot traffic, and they get blocked from the link in the site that they're trying to check, and then this can show false results. It can show that the link is down, but really it's just that the destination website was blocking it, and with the influx of like AI bots, it's just getting more and more common. So as a result, the tool can cease to function and the developers kind of abandon ship and they move on to trying to build something else, a different solution. So we are testing out some new options and we have something on the horizon. But in the meantime, the best way remains the old-fashioned way. And in this case, that means manually checking your links, which sounds tedious. And indeed, it can be more time consuming the more links you have on your site. But we have put a new links report item in the site manager menu that I'm going to show you, which kind of hopefully gives you a bit of a head start. It allows you to download a CSV file that you can open in Excel or Google Sheets, whatever you use, and have a look at the full list of all the URLs that your site links to and what page on your site they can be found on. And then you can kind of work from that to start checking. And I'll give you some tips on like how you might want to start doing that. So let's go back to our Maple demo site. And we'll go to the dashboard. And from here in Site Manager, there's a new line item called Links Report. And this will allow us to, yeah, download the CSV. The first column is going to be the link, and then the second column is the page on your site where that link is found. So you can use that left column. We'll look at the actual report here. I will open it up and let's see. So yeah, you can use the link on the left to check the URLs. So I'll just stretch it out a little bit here. Kind of compresses it when you first download it. But you'll see here it says URL. Here it says found on pages. So these are the pages on your site that contain links, and these are the links. So, you could kind of start going through here and making some educated guesses about which ones probably aren't broken. Anything that's like a high level, top level URL, nels.ca, bclaws.ca, TED Talk, those kinds of things. Like those are usually not going to be broken. It's kind of more these kind of longer, more specific URLs, ones that contain files, things that may have changed, that kind of stuff. So I know this is not ideal, and we're feeling disappointed as well that we couldn't bring you that automated tool. But and you can also skip anything like these Nels links. These are probably mostly good. So yeah, anything that's like co-op related, we're routinely checking and making sure that those are anything in like a shared resource, like the subject guides, that kind of thing. We're keeping track of those, making sure that they're not broken. But yeah, I will definitely let you all know when we have the next automated solution ready. There's one from Internet Archive that we're really interested in. The developers are just really working right now on trying to make it more smooth to use on multiple sites. I think that's one of the barriers, that we have so many sites on our network, and the tool has to be able to work for all of the LibPress sites at the same time. So stay tuned for that. And I hope in the meantime, the links report can be a little bit helpful for you. Something else is just creating more white space. It's beneficial for users with and without disabilities. For those with cognitive or learning disabilities, white space has been shown to ease reading difficulties and improve understanding of content. Reducing visual clutter also provides more breathing room for the elements on your site. It can help reduce eye strain and make it easier to focus on each element of your site. And just note that white space doesn't necessarily mean that the space is white. It could be just the background color, or we could also call it negative space. And we have, with the LibPress 2.0 changes that we're working on, we've now got a way for you to widen your site content area, or get rid of that drop shadow, and kind of increase the basically just ways to increase the horizontal space that your site can take up. So I was just going to demo this, and you can follow along in the LibPress manual. I'm going to try to pop a link in the chat. So if you wanted to take a look, this is kind of what I'll be doing. I'll be working on the Maple demo site again. So we'll go back to our homepage here. So yeah, the drop shadow is hard to see on this one because it's gray, but you all will know it very well. It's this kind of old-fashioned, very early 2000s web styling here, where you have your main website content area that is quite narrow, and then this drop shadow, and then the background area. So we'll go into the customizer. We're going to want to be working in LibPress theme settings. And we'll scroll down until we get to this part called site-wide settings. And we have two settings right at the top here. One of them is called constrain all page elements, and one of them is called use old content width. So we'll start down here with this old content width. So this is limiting to 960 pixels wide. So that means from this edge to this edge is 960 pixels, but you don't really need to memorize those numbers or know what they mean or anything, but you can toggle that off and you'll see immediately the site widens to this newer width that we introduced, and it's 1320 pixels. So a little bit wider, and you can kind of already see, you can toggle back and forth just to see compare and contrast. It just kind of spaces everything out, gives a lot more negative space, and it's just a click of a button and publish. So if you're interested in that on your site, please give it a go. All of these elements that are on all of your pages, we've tested and checked to make sure that they expand nicely with the new width. There's one consideration that just you might want to keep an eye out for is if you have a slideshow on your homepage, when it stretches out, the file might the image might get a little blurry if the file wasn't big enough, but we have some instructions in the manual for that. If you run into that, you can also just send me an email. We can work through that together. So, this might also be just like you're happy with that. You're like, okay, bit wider, bit more white space, good to go. Something else you could consider doing is unconstraining all the page elements. So you can think of those two boundaries on each side as kind of like the constraint. It's kind of holding all that content into this middle area. So if we toggle that off, you'll see that it'll get rid of that constraint, but we also get this effect of the background color taking over the whole page, which I'll address in just a minute. But we'll look at, these bars now go all the way from side to side, and we no longer have that drop shadow, and everything just kind of has a bit more breathing room. So I'll just show you how to change that background color. If you have anything other than white on those sides of your site, whatever is over here, when you uncheck this box, it's going to kind of take over everything, but you just have one more step to get rid of that, which would be to go back one step in the customizer and go into colors, which is right up here at the top. And we just need to reselect a different color. So it could be any color you want. We're going to kind of stick with white. And that just brings everything back to white. So, from where we started, we can see now just like a lot more breathing room, a lot more negative space, making it easier for folks to read and comprehend what's on the page. So I'm not going to save these changes because I'm going to just go back and give us one more look at what it used to look like. So yeah, just a couple of, 3 clicks of a button to make those changes on your site, and want to make sure you knew where to find how to do that. So yeah, there's studies out of MIT and Stanford University that have shown also that having more negative space increases the time that people stay on your site and increases the speed at which they can achieve what they were trying to do on your site, and that they leave more satisfied. So, this is an accessibility fix, but it's also just kind of like a general good thing to do for your site's health. So keeping with this theme of kind of like colors, color contrast, and I'm sorry, I have some construction noise that just started up behind me. Hopefully that's not coming through too loud. So with color contrast, we talked a moment ago about these web content accessibility guidelines, and they recommend a minimum contrast of 4.5 to 1 with text color to background color. So LibPress sites, as I mentioned before, committed to meeting the level AA standards for digital accessibility under Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1. And I've talked about these tools before, but I always like to just remind folks that they exist. The WebAIM color contrast checker, sorry, or the color contrast.cc. So I wanted to do like a little demo of this. So curious if anybody would like to volunteer their site to have the color contrast checked with this tool. So if not, I will use the library demo site, but I'll just wait a minute and see if anybody wants to volunteer their site. Check Kimberly, Bowen. Awesome. Okay, I'll do Kimberly since uh, you were first, but we can also check out Bowen after. So we'll do Kimberly. Okay, so let's use your info banner here. So I'm just going to inspect the source to hopefully be able to grab that color. Oh, info banner. Don't see it. Okay, let's try the menu color. Awesome. Okay, so your navigational menu. So what I'm doing right now is getting the hex code. You might have these written down somewhere, or you can also get to them through the back end of the site, but just for speed, I'm just using the inspect element here. So this is the color of your background for your navigational menu. I'm going to go use the color contrast checker. We also have the web aim. Oh, there's someone arriving late. I'm going to let them in. We have the color contrast checker, which is colorcontrast.cc. We also have the WebAIM contrast checker from what's the name of this group? Oh yeah, they're just WebAIM. Okay, so there's two different tools. They both kind of do the same thing. I like to use this one right now just because it is aesthetically kind of pleasant, but it is just run by one lone developer just kind of doing it as like a passion project, whereas WebAIM is affiliated with an organization that's probably this tool is probably a bit more reliable. If this guy ever decides that he doesn't want to run this tool anymore, it won't be around. But anyway, I'll show you both here. You can decide which one works best for you. And we're going to put that hex code in as the background color. And then let's see, Kimberly, what did you have for oh, you have white. Okay, awesome. So our background color is in and our foreground color is in. So what we want to be looking at is this number right here. So remember we talked about that, 4.5 to 1 minimum. This is like the 4.5 number. So your ratio would be like 7.69 to 1. So you can see across all aspects here, this is, the double A standard we talked about. You have a pass, and you also have that gold standard of triple A pass. So this is a great color contrast. Large and normal is showing kind of like if this was on normal size text or large size text, it's different. So sometimes sometimes your color contrast will pass for large text, but it won't pass for normal text. And say you gave me a different color that was, let's say you gave me this color and this is a fail across the board. Or you're rebranding and you really like the sky blue color, but you put it in here and you're like, oh, well, I guess it's not compatible with white. You can use these sliders to adjust basically until you get something that passes. So you can watch these four boxes kind of slowly change to pass, 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 like as you get darker. So yeah, this could be a way if you're trying to choose a color and you have one in mind, but it doesn't work. You could play around with the hue, saturation, and the lightness is the one that's going to get you to the better contrast quicker. And then you can also mess around with the uh, hue as well. So just a tool to have in your back pocket there if you're creating. And just, yeah, as a reminder, this is good too for anything you're creating in Canva, buttons, images for your slideshow. It's not just like text and background. It's kind of all those different anything with text that's going on a picture or yeah, something like that. So hopefully, if you didn't already know about those, that's helpful to know about. And we'll quickly just talk about plain language standards. So we talk about this in terms of, using using language in your communication that is easy for folks to understand, um, taking into account all the different literacy levels, comprehension styles, and cultural backgrounds that make up your patron base. A good rule is to aim for a grade 7 reading level. So there's this tool called the Hemingway editor, which we can use to test your written content on your site for accessibility. So I'll go back over to the Hemingway editor. So this is what the interface looks like. It's free online tool. You don't have to download anything. Um, they offer, as everything seems to these days, a paid upgrade that allows you to use their AI features, but it works just as well without that. So you have your text box here where you can kind of enter in, the text that you want to check to see what the reading level is at. So I will just go to, I don't know, we'll just grab something from the Maple demo site and throw it in just so you can kind of see what it's going to look like when you put your text in. Because I mentioned like aim for this grade 7 reading level. Well, how do you know what that is? This tool up in the top corner can tell you your readability. So, and there's some more information here if you want to open this pop-up window, which doesn't want to stay open. There we go. So grade 9 is the adult average. So anything like grade 7, 8, 9 reading level is usually pretty good. And of course, if you are writing something that's more technical, it's going to have more technical language. So just take everything here with a grain of salt, but it can just be a good way to get a high level glimpse of like how you're doing. So it's going to show you sentences that are hard to read, which might be like if they're too long or complex, you can kind of maybe break it down into 2 sentences. And then these red sentences are ones that are very hard to read. It could also just be because you might have a punctuation error in there somewhere. So yeah, this is the Hemingway editor. There's a link to it in the accessibility module of the LibPress manual, which there's a link to that in the resources sheet as well. And yeah, that tool is something that it's good to have bookmarked in your web browser just in case you're writing new site content. I'm going to give that a check. Lastly, just a plug for Sa11y and Web Preferences, which 2 free add-ons to your LibPress service. You just need to submit a ticket and let us know if you're interested in them. You may already be using these, and that's great. Sa11y is the staff-facing tool, helps you check your content for accessibility, check your text, your images, your slides, checks your alt text, and gives you tips on how to fix any issues. I used it earlier and it found something that I wasn't even seeing on like the visual side of the site. It was like a link to something that was just kind of like a vestigial bit from old web design. So it's like something that somebody on a screen reader using a screen reader would have seen and been really confused about, but just me looking at it as a sighted person, like it just looked like blank space. So it can catch little things like that. And then Web Preferences is their user-facing tool, allows your site visitors to adjust things like contrast, font. It has the open dyslexic font, can change the text size, text spacing, that kind of thing. And I'll just quickly demo that on the home page here. So when you install the Sa11y, it kind of puts this little icon down in the corner for you. And if you click it, it shows you your errors and your warnings, and you can hover over so it'll tell you what the error is and how to fix it. So none of these buttons have alt text. If a person with a screen reader went over these buttons, they wouldn't be able to read what each button was. So that is obviously a huge issue. Uh, excuse me. And it'll give you warnings, which are things that are like, consider making changes to this, but they're not mandatory. So yeah, that's free. We can add it on just by clicking a button on the back end of your site. So let us know. I'll also show you the web preferences. So that goes up here in the top right, and your site visitors can click that and make all of these different adjustments to what your site looks like for them. There we go. So yeah, changing the background to something that's more accessible. As I mentioned before, the open dyslexic font can be helpful. creating a table of contents. If somebody's using a screen reader, as I mentioned before, the screen readers, they go sequentially through content. So, once they hit this, the screen reader will read this all out so that they don't have to be going scanning through everything. And yeah, it's just all allowing your site visitor to highly customize what the site looks like for them. And we can just reset it back to the default here. So yeah, let me know if you uh, need those installed on your site, and we will do that for you. Thank you for watching this video. For more information, please see the BC Libraries Cooperative website.